Hi, welcome to my new video series for October. It's the spooky time of year many of us love, and as most of you know, I'm a horror suspense author, and I've published 4 short story collections and 2 novels, and love the spooky stuff. So I'm going to present you with an audio version of my short story, Carnival of Atonement, one of my all-time favorites. A bizarre yet fascinating story about a civilization lost in time without laws, yet no one is allowed to leave. Every year the carnival comes to town, and with it the strange customs that force people to atone for their sins in elaborate, brutal exhibitions. If you would, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments what you thought about the story and if you want to get more content like this in the future. You can go to my website, that's PeteAltieri.com, purchase any one of my books there, and they come back to you signed and with a poster and bookmark. Thanks for checking it out, and don't mind those carnival noises in the background. It's that time of year, so go on and enjoy.
Carnival of Atonement, written and narrated by Pete Altieri. Part 1. It was the second Friday in December, and the Carnival of Atonement would start in less than 2 hours. A growing mass of dark clouds began to make their way across Cochise County and encircled the town like an ominous churning wreath. The vibrant lights on the 50-foot Ferris wheel, the intoxicating calliope music of the merry-go-round, the rushing swoosh of the tilt-a-whirl, and the tantalizing smells from the funnel cake and pizza stands were set in contrast against the foreboding ceiling of clouds. The scene was disjointed and rang out like a dissonant chord. Every year when the carnival came to Atonement, it created a rich irony and clashing emotions, mixing the unbridled enjoyment of the citizens with the harshness of its true purpose. To the citizens who counted down the days to the carnival, it brought raw excitement. To those who would have to atone, the carnival unearthed an incredible sense of dread. Atonement was a small, unincorporated town of 2,900 people, according to the last census, 80 miles southeast of Tucson, Arizona. People traveling on I-10 in southern Arizona would likely miss it. An exit off Route 191 that reads Wilcox Dry Lake Annex is the only paved access to Atonement, and unless a person was really trying to find it, they would continue east to New Mexico or south to Mexico. The citizens of the town preferred it that way. Visitors are not welcome in Atonement because of the harsh standards they place upon themselves. There is no police department. Even the Cochise County Sheriff's Department stays away from the unincorporated town. A small family diner, gas station, and grocery store were the only commerce to be found. There was, of course, the Atonement Church of God on the very north end of town. It was the source of all that was just in the small town most never knew existed. The middle-aged pastor of the church was a purveyor of fire and brimstone who shook the rafters every Sunday when he delivered his sermon. Reverend Clayton Henry was the grandson of the original pastor who founded the Atonement Church of God in 1899, only 4 years after the settlement of the town. Reverend Clayton had a wild mane of red hair that cascaded in curling locks to his shoulders. He was married to his childhood sweetheart, Susanna, and they had twin teenage sons, John and Peter. Both boys were looking forward to follow in the Henry family tradition and become preachers themselves. Reverend Clayton usually wore a wide-brimmed black parson hat, black jacket, neatly pressed white dress shirt, bolo tie, black slacks, and spit-shine black shoes. No matter how hot it got in Atonement, The Reverend was in the same dress he wore on Sunday every day of the week. His sparkling hazel eyes and measured tone were captivating to the townsfolk. When the Reverend spoke, it was as if they were speaking directly to God. Since 1899, his grandfather, Reverend Jonathan Henry, and the Atonement Church of God had established a council of 3 men who were respectable members of the town. When a citizen was found to have done something wrong, they would appear before the council in the meeting room, where judgment would be made and their atonement assigned. The council handled minor infractions that were easily fixed. Last week, Ben Shipley was made to pay $250 and 3 chickens to his neighbor, Diego Sanchez, for accidentally damaging his fence when he was doing some work on his property. When it came to more serious matters, Atonement had a truly democratic style of discipline. The citizens would gather at the downtown square and cast paper ballots to vote and decide the fate of the accused. Each person 18 or older was given a ballot to pick guilty or innocent. If the citizen felt the accused was guilty, they would vote for which punishment was a proper atonement. It wasn't often this was necessary, as the citizens of Atonement were there because they wanted to be. The fear of having to face the wrath of your fellow citizens and the fire and brimstone of Reverend Clayton was enough to keep most on the straight and narrow. This obedience was ingrained in them from birth, now 3 generations in perpetuity. They might discuss among themselves the arcane way of things was stifling progress, but deep down they craved the structure and security the rules gave their lives. Frankly, they wouldn't know what to do without them. Reverend Clayton picked the best men available for the council every 5 years. He would also lead the meetings at the square with the help of several volunteers and explain the crime that was alleged. Upon collection of the ballots, the council would count the votes and pass the verdict to Reverend Clayton. He would stand behind an ornate podium while lights around the square cast him in a sort of angelic aura. For this reason, the Reverend would have such meetings in the square at night when he could maximize the desired effect. The preacher knew what power the pulpit wielded, and he made no bones about playing it like a musical instrument. Part 2. Earl Whitecotton was fidgeting in his seat on the second Friday in December 1977. He was sitting in the bleachers along the north wall at the Atonement Elementary School to watch his granddaughter sing in the Christmas program. His wife, Helena, sat next to him, fanning herself with the programs they handed out upon arrival. "It's so hot in here, Earl. Aren't you hot?" Helena asked, beads of perspiration building across her forehead. She mopped her brow with a handkerchief. Earl pretended he didn't hear his wife. His mind was somewhere else, thinking back many years ago, on the night of the Christmas program in 1927. Hearing the chatter of some men sitting behind him, Earl knew he wasn't the only one thinking those same thoughts. The entire room was packed full of people of Atonement, and they all knew how special this night would be. Immediately following the program, everyone would walk to the town square and enjoy the carnival, which would run until Sunday night, when it would be rolled up and put away again until the following December. Walking up the next day, it would be as if the carnival were never there. Where it went after that, no one knew or thought to ask. It was just gone. "Earl! Earl!" Helena said urgently, her voice raising an octave. "Did you hear me?" "Yes, dear, it is hot in here." Earl never looked over at Helena. His eyes were fixated on the double doors that led to the foyer. The large gym with the barrel ceiling and lattice woodwork was unique in design, but did nothing acoustically for the room. The murmur of the crowd was nearly deafening, and the excitement was palpable. Like Earl, most of the adults were glancing to the double doors in anticipation. It was as if they were awaiting the entrance of a king or queen, or the entire Barnum and Bailey circus. The curtains were drawn closed on the stage, but some movement could be seen along with the flashing of lights in some sort of code that meant "get ready" to the students who would be performing. Harold Carr sat in his seat in the front row, center stage. This was the reserved seat he had every year for the Christmas program. His wife, Mary, had passed away 6 years ago from lung cancer. Harold wished Mary could have been alive to see this. They had talked about it often, especially when the topic of the Christmas program came up in conversation. Harold's friends and family hated to bring up the subject when he was around, only because they knew it would result in him getting upset. But this year was different. For the first time in a very long while, Harold had a smile on his face and a certain twinkle in his eye as he waited in his front row seat, glancing every so often over his shoulder at the double doors. It became completely silent the moment the doors opened. As light from the hallway poured into the darkened confines of the gym, 3 elderly men slowly entered. With their heads bowed, they walked single file to the front of the stage. Within 10 seconds, the first voice rang out in the hollow silence, to be followed by an onslaught of jeers, insults, and curses. Within moments, it was boiling over with genuine hatred spewing from the mouths of the audience. Teachers, secretaries, factory workers, farmers, nurses, cashiers, and more from each walk of life spouted a raw, visceral reaction that erupted like a volcano. "You bastards, you don't deserve to live," one woman cried out from the seats at stage left. "Burn in hell, you sinners," screamed one man, his voice hoarse and raspy. A shower of paper cups, newspapers, and other items were being hurled at the 3 men as they continued their slow walk toward the stage. Some of the items bounced off them, yet they kept their heads down in shame and kept walking. The crowd began to scream and throw items at them. Several even stood up and spit into their faces. The 3 men were stoic. A custodian was in the aisle with a flashlight to guide them to the 3 metal folding chairs that were set up directly in front of the stage, a few feet in front of Harold. As if on cue, the gym became perfectly silent again once the 3 men were seated. With their neighbors' saliva dripping down their faces, the 3 men sat motionless and staring ahead. The curtains on the stage were pulled back to start the program. The silence was deafening in anticipation. Part 3. The Christmas program had just concluded in 1927. While the crowds moved in an orderly fashion out of the school and toward the carnival set up on the town square, 4 boys were up to no good. They had snuck out during the program and had gone to a farm in the country. One of the 4, David Suter, was the one who suggested they go to his grandpa's barn where no one would see them. David knew his grandparents were going to be at the program just like the rest of the town. Charles Bonfield had stolen 2 big cigars from his grandpa. The boys wanted to smoke them before heading to the carnival. A 3rd boy, Artie Daniels, was lighting one of the cigars, trying to act older than his 11 years by imitating his father. Charles bit off the end of his and lit it. A 4th boy was Kenny Carr, and he didn't want to smoke cigars with the rest of the boys. He had tried a cigarette one time and threw up for an hour afterward. Kenny was a little slower than the rest of the kids at school, and they teased him a lot. But Kenny had an older sister, Charmaine. The boys in his class all drooled over, so they were letting him hang around in hopes to see more of her. To make things worse, Kenny also had a stutter, so he said as little as possible. He was just glad to feel like he was part of a group, even though he suspected they only wanted him around to see his big sister and her bursting 17-year-old boobs. It was all they talked about. "Come on, Kenny, give it a try," said Artie, coughing out a cloud of smoke. Kenny didn't take it. "I don't know, guys. I really don't want to." Charles and David laughed out loud. Artie tried to hide it, but followed along and laughed too. Kenny kept his head down. "Oh, come on, just take one puff, Kenny. Just one," said Artie. Kenny reached for the cigar, his hand quivering slightly. He dropped it to the ground. In the darkness, despite it being lit, they couldn't see the cigar. "Oh, shit, where the hell did it go? I smell something burning," cried David. The four of them looked around frantically, not knowing what to do. David started to stomp on the hay that was smoldering, but was unable to get it to go out. Then flames started to rise, licking up the side of one of the horse stalls. "Hurry, grab some buckets. This barn will go up fast if we don't put that fire out," David yelled out. He was panicking, thinking about what his grandfather would do if he found out they caused the barn to burn down. "I'm so sorry, David. I didn't mean to drop it." The other three boys were trying to get buckets of water on the fire, but it was getting out of control quickly. "You dumb son of a bitch," David yelled at Kenny, who was now standing in the middle of the chaos, crying. "I'm sorry," Kenny whimpered, tears streaming down his face. Artie cried out, "We need to get out of here. This thing's going up." David picked up one of the empty metal buckets. It was a heavy, galvanized metal. "Not without me killing this little bastard." He swung the metal bucket and connected with a crunch. Kenny toppled over into a pile of hay. Flames began shooting up in every direction as the loft above them started to catch fire. The fire spread to the ceiling joists. The smoke was thick. There were 2 horses in the barn David let loose for fear they would die in the fire. The entire time, he could only think about how his grandfather would whip him for being involved with this. That is, if his father didn't kill him first. "He's out cold, David." "Yeah, you might have killed him." David stood there frozen for a moment, trying his best to think amid the confusion. There were only minutes left before they would all be trapped inside as the roof started to groan and creak under the strain. "If we leave him, they'll just figure he'd started the fire. We could sneak into the carnival and just say we were never here," David said to the group. Flames were crackling in the crisp night air as black smoke poured from every crevice. David knew someone in town would see the blaze. He didn't have time to think it over anymore. He was sure the only answer was to leave Kenny in the barn and get out while they could. No one would have believed that they were not at the carnival. The story would work, David convinced himself. "I don't know, David. I don't think we could keep a secret like that," said Artie, trying to shake Kenny awake. He was breathing shallow but alive. The main support beam was directly over him, and the fire was charring it quickly. It would only be moments before it would fall and kill the boy. "We're all in this together. We got to promise never to tell. We're all guilty," said David. Then he turned and ran for the barn door. Charles and Artie followed behind. There was one thing David, Charles, and Artie didn't realize. Kenny's younger sister, Elizabeth, had seen the boys leaving the Christmas program, and she was worried her brother would get mixed up in some mischief. She knew how the kids picked on Kenny. It took her longer to walk in the dress and fancy shoes she wore to the program. But as she made it to the barn, she saw the fire and the 3 of them run away. She wondered where Kenny was, but assumed he had run like the rest. Part 4. As the curtain opened at the Christmas program in 1977, the stage lights came on and set the scene of a typical Christmas program in an elementary school. The classes, from kindergarten through 6th grade, each performed 2 Christmas-themed songs, much to the enjoyment of the audience and the music teachers who had worked hard with them for the past 2 months. The curtain closed once again for a brief intermission before opening 10 minutes later. This time, the lighting was somber. A replica of the barn at the Suter farm was built to fit the stage, and it was set up so the entire audience at the Christmas program could see inside. They used 3 of the 6th grade boys at the Atonement Elementary School to play David, Artie, and Charles, and a 3rd grader to be little Kenny. The attention to detail was incredible, with the hay, stables, and the brand of the cigars, Swisher King Albert. They even had the old red-painted horseshoe that Grandpa Suter had hung over the door. In the metal folding chairs, the three older men sat still and stared ahead at the performance. Tears welled up in David's eyes, and Charles, too. Artie was not giving the crowd the satisfaction to show the performance upset him. He was the most bitter of the three of them. It was their atonement to come to the Christmas program every year to watch the reenactment. The rest of the year they lived on the outskirts of town in 3 run-down farmhouses only a few miles from each other, and they were shunned by the rest of the citizens. They had to stay in atonement. It was a part of the enigma that made the town such a unique place with stringent rules. No one ever left, no matter how bad it got. Even David, Charles, and Artie stayed, despite being treated like lepers and tormented every year on the second Friday of December. Now this was the 50th time they had to watch the Christmas program. In late December of 1927, at a town meeting in the square, the 3 boys were brought before the Assembly of Citizens. Kenny had been found dead in the embers of the barn the morning after the fire. At first, it was a mystery as to what he was doing in the Suter barn and why there were remnants of 2 cigars found near his body. Then Kenny's sister Elizabeth came forward to tell what she had seen that night, and everything became perfectly clear. The citizens each cast a vote, and it was a unanimous guilty verdict for all 3. Their atonement was being shunned like they were, and having to come to the Christmas program every year to see what they did. But that wasn't all. Not for murder. On the 50th anniversary of the murder, the 3 were going to experience one last atonement. David, Charles, and Artie had dreaded this day for the past 50 years. They would discuss it amongst themselves in the confines of their homes. They knew it was coming, and the fact it took 50 years to get there made fearing it that much worse. Everyone in the crowd knew something big was going to happen, even the children in the play. This year, the Carnival of Atonement would be a truly special event. It would be an atonement no one in the town would ever forget. The rest of the play went on as the audience watched, mesmerized. Most were only able to think about what was coming after the performance, including David, Charles, and Artie. As the children on stage acted out Kenny being struck in the head with the metal bucket, the simulated flames the younger children made with yellow and orange construction paper were used to remind the 3 what a fiery hell they chose to spark that night in 1927. If the gym building hadn't been a wooden structure, the town probably would have had them lighted on fire every year for dramatic effect. While the boys on stage ran out of the barn, the spotlight was on the smaller boy who was playing Kenny's part. Then the spotlight went out, and the audience was perfectly silent. The stage curtain was drawn shut slowly as the gym overhead lights came on. No one said a word as they silently and in an orderly fashion shuffled out of the gym and into the main hallway, which led to the front entrance of the school. They all knew what was going to happen next and were most anxious to get a good spot to watch. The last people to leave the school were David, Charles, and Artie. They walked slowly toward the town square behind the mass of citizens making their way to the same place. The Carnival of Atonement was waiting for them. The big Ferris wheel was spinning, and its lights were flashing brightly enough to see it many blocks away at the school. The carnival workers were making their last-minute safety inspections of each ride. The games were ready to go, and the smell of the funnel cakes, pizza, nachos, and tamales were enticing. Reverend Clayton was also there waiting, and already perched behind the podium, running through the speech he had written years before, knowing this day would come, and that he would be the one to enforce the atonement his grandfather laid out in December of 1927. Oddly, It was a crystal clear night with a brisk chill in the air, not uncommon in southwestern Arizona, just as it had been in 1927. The Reverend spent extra time primping his flowing red locks and making sure to adjust the lights so the podium was the focal point and not the carnival that surrounded it. This would be his time to shine, and Atonement would remember him forever because of it. Part 5. The crowd gathered in the square as the three men were led to chairs to the left of the podium. Reverend Clayton wore a dramatic countenance, held his hat firmly, and stared at the three men sitting next to him. The men looked considerably older than their years. Those 50 years of exile had not been kind to them. The crowd was quiet, but it was only a matter of time before their rage would explode and the ugly underbelly of the town would be revealed. While the citizens liked to think of themselves as pure and living in a utopia where they didn't need police, that was the furthest thing from the truth. Even so, their piousness was beyond compare. Looking out at the faces before him, Artie knew many of their dark secrets. He kept his opinions within the confines of the private conversations the three men had over the years. They all heard the rumors around town about which married people were committing infidelity. Living in the shadows made it easy for the three men to listen to people talking, since most assumed the three shunned men were akin to inanimate objects. It was no different than any other place on the face of the earth. There were shady business deals and people that took advantage of others who were less fortunate. There were illegal drugs to be found if a person knew the right places to go find them. There was gambling and an assortment of other vice crimes, including prostitution. The way the citizens of Atonement acted high and mighty, handing out punishments to those unfortunate enough to get caught, made it that much more hypocritical. I would like to welcome everyone to the 1977 Carnival of Atonement. This has been a tradition in our town since its founding in 1895, boomed Reverend Clayton from the podium. His voice was clear and rhythmic. He looked back and forth, scanning the crowd before him. The atmosphere was electric, and he reveled in it. 50 years ago, these men were given an atonement on this very square. My grandfather, Reverend Jonathan Henry, stood in this spot and read the sentence unanimously decided upon. David thought back to that night in December of 1927. It seemed like forever ago. There were very few nights where he didn't dream about it. He could see Kenny's empty stare after he crumpled to the floor of the barn, the smoldering hay surrounding his tiny frame. He felt a tremendous amount of guilt over what he had done. David felt bad for the Carr family, and he couldn't look any of them in the eye after that happened. He knew they all hated him. Despite the many years that had gone by, it didn't seem to get any easier. David was also burdened with the guilt that the other two, Charles and Artie, were given the same sentence he was, despite the fact that they were only there and went along with his plan to leave Kenny to die in the fire. David was the leader of the group, and if he decided to do something, Charles and Artie followed. Charles was also thinking about that night and wondering how his life would have been different if he hadn't gone out to the Suter farm with the others. He resented David for being the one who organized the meeting in his grandfather's barn and for hitting little Kenny Carr with the bucket hard enough to kill him. Charles knew he was the one who had gotten the cigars. He had taken them from his grandfather's private stash. Charles wished he hadn't been there that night, and having to relive it every year with a dramatic performance was a recurring nightmare he wished would go away. Artie had a bottomless amount of guilt inside of him, thinking about letting Kenny die in the fire that night. He had let that guilt fester without an outlet, and it had turned into a terrible bitterness. Artie was sick and tired of waking up angry every morning for the past 50 years. Going through the day hating the world was too much for him now. He looked out at the crowd, the sound of Reverend Clayton's voice fading into the background. Artie could see the expressions on their faces. They hated him, Having to live in exile for one more day was too much to bear. Reverend Clayton was raising his voice even higher as the audience stood in awe. It was Jesus in Matthew from the New Testament who said, "Ye have heard that it hath been said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you, that ye resist not evil, but whosoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek, turn to him the other also." His voice resounded throughout the square, and his hands were up high, trembling with fury, appealing directly to God to give him the strength to do what was needed. So I ask you, citizens of Atonement, do we take an eye for an eye or turn the other cheek? The crowd was silent as Reverend Clayton stepped away from the podium and motioned for David, Charles, and Artie to rise and follow him. The three did as they were told, moving solemnly. As they walked, it was obvious what was different about the carnival this year. In the middle of the square was a life-size replica of the barn. It was almost identical to the one that Jim Suter had built in 1910 on his farm. The hay, the stalls, the red horseshoe over the door were all in place. It was like taking a time machine back to that chilly December night in 1927. Each of them had a sickening pit in their stomach, seeing the barn like that on a page torn from an old photo album discovered in a cedar chest. The crowd watched the procession and was ready to see the spectacle for themselves. It was the most extreme atonement that had ever been brought down, but since there had never been a murder in the town before, and not one since, it seemed appropriate. Suddenly, there was some movement at the rear of the barn. David noticed it at first, and then Charles and Artie did as well. My grandfather placed the decision on how the atonement was to be carried out firmly on my shoulders. The crime of murder had never happened here in Atonement, and because of that, the citizens had to make a difficult decision. The punishment was not clear, yet I feel that God himself has spoken to me and told me what to do, said Reverend Clayton, his voice still strong and firm. While David, Charles, and Artie stood only a few feet from the barn, with the crowd behind them, silently watching on, the Reverend moved back and forth, still talking about the decision that he was forced to make. The whole thing was playing out like a dream, and the movement inside the barn was concerning the three men. They didn't know what was going on. Some of the citizens began to whisper to each other, not understanding Reverend Clayton and his apparent confusion to carry out the final phase of the punishment his own grandfather read 50 years before. From the shadows inside the barn out walked Harold Carr. He was visibly upset, yet he did not hesitate to stand in the center for all the audience to see. The murmurs of the crowd became louder as the citizens realized something different than what they expected was about to happen. Reverend Clayton motioned for the three men to step up inside the barn. The crowd inched closer, realizing that things were about to get interesting. Part 6. Someone from the Reverend's right side handed him a lit torch, the flame shooting out at least a foot, dancing in the cool breeze. The crowd instantly focused on the fire. 50 years of thinking about this night was about to end for those old enough to remember that December in 1927. Those younger would have heard the stories told by their grandparents and parents, passing through the generations like a priceless heirloom. Everyone in Atonement knew about the murder of little Kenny Carr and the three despicable ones who had carried it out. They all craved their pound of flesh. They all wanted to see this judgment day on earth and to put an end to this travesty for once and for all. So I hand this torch to you, David Suter, Reverend Clayton began, so that you may be forced to confront the demons that have haunted you these 50 years. David took the torch, his hand quivering slightly. He had no idea what was going on. This was not the atonement that had been decided on 50 years ago. If we were to carry out the punishment as it was first decided, the three of you would be placed inside the barn and burned to death at the hand of Harold Carr, an eye for an eye. But I think it would be far worse that you light this barn on fire and the three of you stand outside with the rest of us while poor Harold Carr burns alive, just like what you did to his cousin 50 years ago." The Reverend's eyes were wild, and he smirked. The crowd was dumbfounded. Harold stood there, his eyes were now closed. He had spent the last 50 years waiting to avenge the death of his cousin, Kenny. Kenny's parents and two sisters had been killed in a tragic car accident in 1931, so Harold was the only living blood relative in Atonement. He was supposed to be the one to light the fire and watch the three men burn to death. Now the tables were turned because Reverend Clayton wanted to carry out what he thought was a more appropriate atonement. Harold was struggling with it, but he was raised not to question the Reverend, whomever it may be. God was speaking through him. The Reverend continued, "To live the rest of your days shunned by the town, coming to watch the Christmas program every year, and to have a fresh memory of burning Harold Carr alive would be a living hell you would be forced to endure, knowing, of course, that when you die, you will all be condemned to spend an eternity in actual hell. For you three, dying tonight would be far too easy. It would be like letting you off the hook. Not on my watch." Reverend Clayton scanned the crowd before him. Each one of them was captivated by his words. "You must atone." David stood in the middle between Charles and Artie. He looked at each of them as he held the torch. They offered nothing. The look in their eyes was the same as his own. They were confused and horrified at the thought of living another day like they had for 50 years. What if they lived into their 80s or 90s? Could they endure living the way they had? Leaving town and suicide were not options for anyone in Atonement. The crowd inched even closer and slowly. From the back of the group, a chant began to grow. It was quiet at first, but each time they spoke, the volume increased. Within 2 minutes, it was almost deafening. "Light the fire! Light the fire!" the crowd chanted. Their eyes were glazed over with divine intoxication and reflected the light from the flame. David's hand shook, and the flame from the torch seemed to move in rhythm with the chanting. Harold stared directly at David in defiance. As scared as he was to die like his cousin did, Harold was honored the Reverend decided to make him a martyr. He realized it was going to be more painful to the three of them to watch him die and to have that on their conscience for the rest of their days. Harold knew he was going to heaven. He was going to see Kenny again and many other friends and relatives who had passed on. He was at peace with it and realized he was serving a higher purpose. "Light the fire, the crowd continued to chant. "Go on, David, light the fire. Do it," Harold cried out over the crowd noise. As if in a dream, David leaned forward and allowed the torch to touch the hay. It caught fire in seconds. Light the fire, the crowd continued to chant. Part 7. As the flames began to engulf the barn, no one noticed a stray ember drift into the cool night sky. A strong wind suddenly picked up from the west and knocked over the barn, completely engulfing the screaming Harold. He writhed in agony beneath the rubble. The crowd collectively shrieked as it toppled, sending fire spreading in all directions. It was moving very quickly, despite the efforts of the crowd to stomp it out. "Remain calm, please, remain calm," said Reverend Clayton, trying not to panic. He looked around the pulpit for the fire extinguishers they had on standby. In the madness, he wasn't able to find them. The large crowd on the square was shocked at what they were witnessing. Flames had spread from the barn in each direction with a ravenous fury. They tried to run, but the strong wind seemed to encircle the group like an invisible fence, not letting anyone move away from the square. The desert willow trees that stood tall around the perimeter were now engulfed in flames. A thick black smoke billowed toward the sky. Men, women, and children were all screaming. The fire was moving so quickly they were unable to avoid being caught up in it. It seemed that there was nothing they could do. The flames had completely taken over the Ferris wheel as the metal warped, causing it to collapse on nearly 100 people. Sparks shot in every direction. Electricity sizzled. The dozens of booths with games and food were also completely swallowed up by the flames. David, Charles, and Artie were dumbfounded like the rest of Atonement. The wind kept them where they stood like a divine embrace, forcing them to watch what was happening. Each of them realized it was their awful deeds back in 1927 that were the reason for what was happening. Harold's screams were over now as he succumbed to the raging fire, as the wind whipped embers in every direction and onto the frantic citizens of Atonement. David, Charles, and Artie were covered in flames, screaming like the rest. A dense black smoke billowed. Reverend Clayton held his wife's hand as they both were overtaken by the fire that had completely consumed the square. Husbands, wives, and children huddled together in agony as the mighty wind refused them safe passage from the spectacle. The entire population of Atonement was roasted alive. It was as if the town passed judgment on itself, allowing the entire population to collectively atone for their sins against each other. Other towns could see the smoke for days coming from Atonement, but no one came to investigate. Everyone knew enough to stay away from the strange place. The fire from the square continued to move from neighborhood to neighborhood, taking house after house until nothing was left. The fire consumed it all. It was as if something of this world knew the town had gone mad and was cleansing the earth of the scourge that had become far too pious and righteous for its own good.